Welcome friends to this week 9 lectures of soil science and technology, and in this lecture we will be covering some important aspects like what is soil degradation and what is soil erosion, what are the different processes of soil erosion, what is universal soilless equation, and then we will be discussing about different types of wind erosions as well as tillage erosions, and finally we will be starting the organic pollutants which are present in the soil. So, in the first, the topic which we will be covering in this lecture is basically soil erosion and land degradation. And in the next topic which we will be discussing is basically the universal soilless equation. After that, we will be discussing in details about uh, conservation tillage, and then the next topic will be wind erosion as well as tillage erosion, and finally in week 9 of lectures we'll be covering the organic pollutants. So let us start with the soil erosion and soil land degradation. uh, the basic concepts which we'll be covering in this topic is land degradation and its process, and then soil erosion and its different types, and then water erosion of soil and its control. So, what is land degradation? Land degradation, is basically somewhat similar to soil erosion, which is basically conversion of soil to sediment. So, land degradation is basically, in other words, is the reduction in the capacity of the land to provide the ecosystem goods and perform functions and services that support society and nature. So, basically this land degradation is caused by desertification, overgrazing, deforestation and inappropriate agricultural practices. So, important are again the desertification is the conversion of lands to deserts, and overgrazing by the animals, as well as deforestation, that means continuous removal of the forest area, the conversion of the forest area, and inappropriate agricultural practices. So, if you see the global land and soil degradation trend in billions of hectares, you will see that the three major factors for global land and soil degradations are non-soil desertification as well as non-soil deforestation, and finally the soil deforestation. So, the soil degradation can be also in the billion of hectares, and a 2 billion of hectares land is undergoing soil degradation, is affected by soil degradation, and the soil degradation is again divided into different causes or causal factors. For example, you will see that wind erosion accounts for 28% of the total soil erosion, chemical deterioration results in 4% of the total soil degradation, physical deterioration accounts for 12% of the total soil degradation, whereas the water erosion is the major component of soil degradation, which accounts for 56% of the total soil degradation. If you want to see what is the level or what is the scale of this land degradation or soil degradation, you will see that 38% of the soil degradation can be termed as slight degradation, whereas 40% are basically moderate and 15% are severe, and while 0.5% are extreme soil degradation. So, obviously the moderate soil degradation is major component among all these, while the extreme soil degradation is only 0.5%. So, uh, let us go ahead and see what are the other trends of soil degradation. So, this shows the basically different worldwide scenario of soil degradation. You can see that the red uh, patches basically shows the very degraded soil, and the yellow patches are basically shows the degraded soil, whereas the white patches are stable soil, and the other parts of these areas are basically the soils without vegetation. So, basically these are representing different types of desert areas. So, you can see the worldwide scenario of the soil degradation. Obviously, the very degraded soils are are distributed throughout the world. And as far as the Indian condition is concerned, all the majority of the soil comes under this very degraded soil, specifically the western as well as the middle portion of Indian subcontinent. So that shows the severity of this problem uh, of soil degradation. So let us go ahead and see what is the land degradation by different continents. So you can see that Europe land is most degraded because its long history of intensive agriculture. However, Asia's and Africa's soils are fast becoming degraded. So that shows the importance uh, of controlling the soil degradation, specifically in Indian subcontinent. So if we go ahead and see what is the downward spiral of land degradation, it basically shows different cause and effects of sequential cause and effects of land degradation. As we can see here, it is a degraded land, and where all the vegetation have been ultimately removed, which causes different types of soil erosion. So for example, in this is the downward spiral, so it is basically goes downward, which basically shows the increasing land degradation. And obviously at the starting point, it starts with vegetative degradation, that means removal of the vegetation, and which ultimately causes the soil exposed to erosion. So when the vegetation cover is removed, soil is much more exposed to erosion, specifically different types of water based erosion, and I'll talk about those things in the next in a couple of slides. And ultimately when the soil is exposed to erosion, that will create the losses of humus and nutrients because of water runoff. And as a result of this loss of humus and nutrients, obviously there will be further reduced plant cover and roots, because they cannot survive in those nutrient limiting condition. So this reduced plant cover and roots ultimately creates a severe soil loss, because there will be further removal of vegetative cover from the ground, and as a result of that there will be lost depth and water storage, and and finally it will be producing extreme vegetative degradation and extreme soil degradation. So extreme soil degradation is basically the final step, and obviously remember that these all the processes are interrelated, and it always starts with the vegetative degradation. So that's why there is always worldwide push for afforestation, as well as covering as much as surface area of the soil, as much as soil surface with vegetative cover. So that shows the importance of different vegetative cover. So let us go ahead and see what are the different major types of soil degradation. We can divide the soil degradation in three major types. One is physical, then chemical, and biological. And in the physical, obviously soil erosion by water is the major the component, and soil erosion by wind and soil erosion by tillage, soil compaction and reduced water storage capacity. All these are physical forms of soil degradation. And in the biological, soil degradation basically shows loss of soil biological diversity, and the depletion of soil organic matter, and loss of plant animal microbial biomass. And in case of chemical degradation, it shows the nutrient depletions, and then salinization, alkalization, then acidification, and finally toxic contamination. So you can see all the physical, chemical, and biological processes are responsible for soil degradation, and depending on different types of agents of degradation, they are separated into different categories. So the definition of soil erosion is the movement of weathered rock and soil particles from one place to another. You can see in this picture the soil underneath the tea has been totally removed as a result of water erosion, and this is a physical form of erosion where water is a major agent for creating the soil erosion. So What there are two different terms, one is called geologic erosion, another is accelerated erosion. Now geological erosion is basically natural erosion of soil without human influences, and in this type of erosion new soils form at a higher rate than the rate of erosion, thereby there is a maintenance of a balance all the time. And finally it depends on rainfall and type of regolith. You have already known about the regolith. Regolith is the parent material basically which is present at the bottom layer of soil profile. And accelerated erosion, this is kind of human induced kind of erosion. So geologic erosion accelerated by human influences like overgrazing, deforestation, tillage, etc. are they are basically coming under this accelerated erosion. And in this type of erosion soil is eroded at a faster rate than new soil formation, exposing deeper layers. So you can see here in this picture, obviously this is the tillage mediated erosion or tillage erosion based erosion. So you can see we have as a result of tillage different types of furrow and ridges are developed, and in these ridges soils are in these ridges the soils are much more exposed to different types of wind as well as water erosion. So thereby they move away through runoff water. So this is one example of eroded ridge, and which is an example of accelerated erosion. So let us go ahead and see what are the different impacts of soil erosion. Obviously there are some on-site damages. What are the on-site damages? Like loss of topsoil and associated essential nutrients and organic matter, and then spread of diseases from higher to lower areas, and uprooting of trees and seedlings, and then reduced infiltration, increased runoff and further erosion, and finally overall soil productivity is greatly reduced. So all these are the outcome of soil erosion. Obviously when there is a loss of topsoil, it will obviously it will obviously uh, also remove the essential nutrients which is present in the soil as a result of CEC, and also which is bound to the organic matter, and spread of disease from higher to lower areas due to the runoff movement of soil from the movement of soil in runoff from one areas to another areas, and then uprooting of the trees and seedlings. Obviously they will not anchor further in the soil because of soil has moved away from that place, and the reduced infiltration obviously due to the movement of due to the loss of organic matter, there will be reduced infiltration, and there will be increased runoff and further erosion, and overall as a result overall soil productivity will be greatly reduced. So what are the different offsite damages? Offsite damages are sediments which basically moves from one area to another area and ultimately causes turbidity, eutrophication, and raises levels of river, causing the flooding. You can see here with the movement of this is basically shows the movement of sediments in the water body. And obviously another effect is wind blown particles affects fruits and foliages, increases maintenance and cleaning cost, and causes different types of health hazards. So wind blown particles also very much important for different types of health hazards, especially the particulate matter which are blown through different wind is causing nowadays greater grave soil grave human health hazards, particularly in different cities across India. So let us discuss what is eutrophication. Obviously eutrophication is basically a scenario when lakes, streams and estuaries are over fertilized, and excessive product which over fertilization comes because of different types of enrichment of different water bodies from the runoff, which basically carries soil along with some nutrients. So when these nutrients enters into the water body, they creates excessive production of aquatic organic matter, and this aquatic organic matter can become water quality problem because they used up all the dissolved oxygen which is present in the water, and as a result the eutrophication process can be enhanced. So due to the use of all the dissolved oxygen which is present in the water, all the organisms which are aerobic organisms which are present in the water, they become dead. So this is called eutrophication. So you can see in this picture, obviously there are two scenarios. One is before eutrophication you can see a clear water, and after eutrophication you can see a algal bloom which occurs due to the high enrichment of nutrient in this water body, and as a result of that all the aerobic organisms which are present in this water get extinct. So this is the eutrophication, and this is a an effect of off-site soil erosion. So what is soil loss tolerance value, or T? So it is the soil loss tolerance value, or T, is basically devised by USDA, or United States Department of Agriculture and Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. The T value is the maximum amount of soil that can be lost through erosion in a particular year without affecting its long term productivity, and for most of the agricultural soil in US the T values is considered as 11 megagram per hectare or 11 tons per hectare, and at this rate loss of soil and formation of new soils are in equilibrium over a period of 200 years. So this is an important concept, that soil loss tolerance values. So let us see what are the different mechanics of water erosion. Since water erosion is a major causal factor of soil erosion, let us see what are the mechanics of soil erosion. So you can see here there are three major processes of water based erosion. One is called detachment, then the second one is called transport, and third one is deposition. So the first one is detachment, which basically shows the splashing effect of raindrops, which basically erodes the soil. So you can see is the splashing effect of raindrops. So it is a falling raindrop, and when raindrop falls over the surface, it causes the detachment. So this is the first process. The second process is the floods. Then the floods then carry the eroded particle downstream. As you can see, these eroded particles or detached particle then carried downstream along with the flood water, and ultimately it will deposit at the it will deposit downstream, which is called the deposition process. So basically mechanics of water erosion can be explained in terms of these three different processes. So what are the different types of water erosion? The first and important type of water erosion is called splash erosion, and the splash erosion, remember that the bigger the raindrop, the faster it hits the soil. So you can see the raindrops are falling, and ultimately it is hitting the soil, and ultimately there is further detachment of the soil particles. So finally, a drop of rain causes soil to splash, and gravity causes more particles to move down than upslope. So as a result of this splash erosion, the bigger part, the soil basically splash away, and ultimately they all the bigger clods, they break down, and the individual soil particles move away with the flood water from one place to another place. So this is the splash erosion, and let us see what are the other three types of erosion. The other one is sheet erosion, where erosion occurs more or less uniformly, and small stones protects the erosion of the soil underneath. As you can see here, basically in this sheet erosion, a sheet of it will look like that a sheet of soil is moved away due to the erosion, and as a result of that, small stones protect the erosion of the soil underneath. And the another type of erosion is called real erosion, and this erosion occurs as water concentrates in small channels. So you can see these are the very small channels through water concentrates, and as a result erosion occurs in this channel, and subsequent cultivation erases this reel. However, the soil is there. So these reels can be these reels can be erased using the subsequent cultivation in this field. However, the soil will be permanently lost here. And gully erosion basically an extreme form of soil erosion, and in this type of erosion, you know, gully, you know, it causes deep channels, and subsequent cultivation cannot correct the gully. So this is very important, and this is the difference between the real erosion and gully erosion. Again, in case of gully erosion, there is a there basically the formation of small channels, and these gully erosion can be you know, these reels can be erased using the subsequent cultivation. However, the soil is permanently lost. However, in case of gully erosion, there is deep channels, and these you know, cultivate, you know, subsequent cultivation cannot correct the gullies. So if you see what are the different slopes which are responsible for you know, different soil erosion, or in other words, uh, which is soil erosion occurs at what slope. So you can see top at the top there is obviously sheet erosion followed by reel erosion, and in the lower depths obviously there will be formation of the gullies. So depends on the slope, these you know, these erosion also varies from or in other words, these three different erosion like sheet, reels and gullies depends on the slope of the land. And these gullies erosion basically occurs in the downstream areas. So how to control the gully erosion? Now, one of the way of controlling the gully erosion is the check dams. So these check dams is basically a small, sometimes temporary dam constructed across swales, you know, drainage ditch or waterways to counteract erosion by reducing the water flow velocity. So this is the general outline of a check dam. You can see there is a lower spillway at the center, and there is a splash apron just at the bottom of the check dam, and these dam basically anchored into the gully walls. So you can see this is a properly constructed gully walls, and these check dams are basically made to reduce the velocity of the water flow so that it causes low amount of or lesser amount of soil erosion. So this is one of the most effective way of controlling this gully erosion. Another one is you know, you know, control of accelerated erosion. Now in semi-arid lands, overgrazing and improper cultivation should be avoided. Obviously you can see improper management on the right side of the fence due to overgrazing. You can see all the soils are mostly, you know, mostly all the soils are bare, and as a result there is a high amount of soil erosion. And in forest, accelerated erosion can be controlled by proper cutting and trailing of timber in right time, and rather than run of raindrops falling from leaves of trees cause much erosion. So forest floor containing organic matter should be preserved to prevent erosion. So you can see erosion due to lack of forest floor, and thus it is very important to cover you know, the forest floor, you know, the forest floor should be you know, should contain more amount of organic matter to prevent the soil erosion. Now crop rotation is a very important way of controlling the erosion, and it is basically alternating the crop planted. Basically here you can see it is you know, crop rotation, you know, between corn and soybean, and it can restore the nutrients to soil and fight pest and disease. So basically alternating the crop planted is an example of crop rotation. And contour farming, this is an example of contour farming, and is basically planting along the contour lines of slopes, which basically helps reduce erosion on hillsheds. Intercropping is basically mixing crops such as strip cropping, which basically can provide nutrients and reduce the erosion. As you can see here, you know, mixing crops in the strips, they are growing different types of crops in different strips, and ultimately you know, it can help in reducing the soil erosion. Alley cropping, you can see the growing the crops in the alleys, alternate alleys, the big trees as well as the and the other crops in the alleys. So this is an example of alley cropping, and it helps in reducing the soil erosion. Terracing is basically cutting the stair steps or terraces in the this is the across the hills. So this is the only way to farm in extremely steep hills, hillsides without causing massive erosion, and it is very labor intensive, remember, to create, but it has been a mainstay for centuries in the Himalayas as well. And this, so if you visit the Himalayan regions, you will see extensively this terracing cultivation process, specifically for rice cultivation, and this is one of the major way of fighting against the soil erosion in these extremely hilly areas. And conservation tillage, we will be discussing in details about the conservation tillage. There are no tillage and reduced tillage farming, which basically leaves old crops residues on the ground instead of plowing it into the soil, and this covers the soil, keeping in place. So here you can see corns are growing up. These are the corn plants which are growing up of a cover crop. So growing out of a cover crop. So this is an example of a conservation tillage. And let us see what are the control of erosion in constructed sites. In the constructed site, obviously there is another huge amount of soil get lost. So excavation should be done in low rainfall periods, and then at one particular time only one portion of the land should be cleared and graded, and you can see disturbed soil should be covered with vegetation as soon as possible. Finally, we have to control the flow of runoff to retain or detain most of the water and move the excess safety of the site without destructive gully formation. And finally, sediment should be trapped before releasing into the excess runoff water offsite. So guys, let us wrap up here. Let us stop here, and we'll start from the next slide in the next lecture, and we'll be trying to finish this soil degradation in the next lecture. And we have learned several new things in this lecture. What are the different mechanics of water erosion, and how, what are the different types of water erosion, and what are the different ways of controlling this water erosion. And in the next lecture we'll be discussing about the other aspects of soil erosion, and then we'll be starting the universal soil ice equation. Thank you, and let us meet in the next lecture.